Hey guys, today we'll be having a look at myology, which is the study of microscopic muscle anatomy, and also the sliding filament theory, which is looking at how muscles actually contract. So first of all, we'll have a look at the anatomy. You've got the muscle belly there, which is the main section of the muscle. If you imagine, say for example, the biceps, this is a really good example of that. Now, the muscle is actually divided up into lots of little bunches of fibers, and that's called a fascicle. So one bunch is called a fascicle, and it makes it a lot easier for the muscle to organize its structure if it's built that way. Now, a fascicle has a lot of muscle fibers within it. So obviously that picture is just hand drawn. A real muscle would have millions of fibers in there and microscopic, you wouldn't be able to see them. Under a microscope though, it would come up as a striated or a striped appearance. So when you break down that muscle and you go to the muscle fiber, that's also known as a muscle cell. There's a few dots on there, they're called the nucleus, and a little strand that you can pull out even further is called a myofibril. So the muscle's not only built, so it's got different bunches of muscle fibers, the muscle fiber themselves also have bunches of myofibrils. So if you break the myofibril down even further, you've got little cross-sectional areas, and these appear when you look at them under a microscope, and they're called a sarcomere. So one section from the black line to the black line, that's called a sarcomere. So that actually is called a contractile unit, and when the muscle contracts, those black lines actually get closer together. So it's sort of like an elastic band that's being pulled apart, moving closer in when it's relaxed. Okay, so the myofibril, if we have a look at the sarcomere there, and we break it down a little bit further and make it bigger. So the sarcomere from black line to black line, you can see that there's two different strands in there. There's a thick red strand and a blue thin strand. So the blue thin strand is actually called actin, and that's called a thin filament. And that's found in the muscle. It's a contractile fiber, as is myosin, which is the thick filament. And those two filaments work together to produce the contraction. There's also a name for that black line, which is the Z line. There's a few other names that will pop up on the next slide that we'll have a look at in a minute. So when contraction actually occurs, what happens is the thick filament, or the myosin, actually has little things called cross bridges, and they look a little bit like oars. And what they do is actually latch onto the actin and sort of pull it in. So as all of those little oars pull on the actin moves in closer and closer and makes the muscle contract. So what ends up happening is the Z lines move closer together. So you'll remember that in a previous picture, I said that when the muscle contracts, those black lines move in closer, and that's this happening here. So what also happens, and this is a new name, is the I band also becomes smaller. Now the I band is simply the region between the myosin and the Z line. So there's a little bit of space there, and that getting smaller proves to us that the muscle is actually contracting. Another region that also gets smaller is where there is only myosin occurring, and that's called the H zone. And that also is an indicator, if it gets smaller, that the muscle is contracting. So for contraction to actually occur, we need a message from the brain. So it will travel down the spinal cord, obviously, and it needs to travel through a nerve or a motor neuron. So the motor neuron is connected to all of the muscle fibers which make up a motor unit. So one motor unit is one motor neuron plus all of the muscle fibers that it controls, because the message doesn't have to just go through one neuron to one muscle fiber. It can reach quite a few. So if we then break that down even further, this is a diagram that explains the connection between a motor neuron and also the muscle fiber. So this is down to the nitty-gritty, the microscopic. It's very, very hard to see this without a powerful microscope. So if we start off, we're looking at the nerve terminal. So this is where the end of the motor neuron is, and there is always a space between it and the muscle fiber. There's also a synaptic vesicle. Now that's very important. That little vesicle has chemicals in it that sends the message across the void. Then there's the muscle fiber itself. So the grey is the motor neuron, the red is the muscle fiber, and all the space in there is very, very tiny, but the space remains nonetheless. And then last of all is the acetylcholine receptor. So what happens is the synaptic vesicle will actually release acetylcholine. Acetylcholine will then travel with that neural impulse, I suppose, and take it across the void or the neuromuscular junction, and the acetylcholine receptors will pick it up. So once the muscle fiber has received the acetylcholine message, then it takes that as the cue to contract. So just in summary, you've got the nerve terminal, so the message comes from the brain down through the nerve to the nerve terminal. It stimulates the synaptic vesicle to release the acetylcholine. The acetylcholine is carried across the neuromuscular junction, where it's received by an acetylcholine receptor on the muscle fiber, and then chemicals from there will then take the message to the actual contractile units, to the sarcomeres, to then contract, and then you've got movement. Now, obviously, this all happens in a split second, because if you choose to speak, for example, your facial muscles are all responding to this sort of stimuli. So you can see how quickly our bodies are moving. You've got other things where, say in gameplay or a team sport, where you respond to something in a split second, your brain has suddenly released a chemical message that's gotten to your muscles in lightning speed, and it's just incredible how quickly the body can work. Okay, so just in summary, the basic breakdown of the muscle. So a muscle is divided into bunches of muscle fibers, and those bunches are called fascicles. The muscle fibers themselves are also divided into bunches of contractile strands, and they're called myofibrils. The myofibrils have cross-sectional units called sarcomeres, and in those sarcomeres you have actin and myosin, and the myosin binds to the actin in the sarcomere, and that actually causes contraction. Now that's considered a sliding filament theory. It's a bit hard to prove all of these things, so usually what ends up happening is someone forms a theory about it, and that becomes standard knowledge. And then with the message from the brain, you've got the motor unit, which is the motor neuron, and it connects to the muscle fibers. Then an electrical impulse will go from the brain through the muscle, an electrical impulse travels from the brain to the muscle fiber via the motor neuron, and where the motor neuron and that muscle fiber meet, that's called the neuromuscular junction, and the electrical impulse is carried across that neuromuscular junction by a chemical called acetylcholine. So there you have it. We'll obviously go through this in more depth in class. If you have any questions, please make sure to email me. Thanks for listening.